practitioners, people who are coming out of things like community science and environmental justice, who are interested in putting our skills to respond to what we would accurately foresaw as the dismantling of environmental regulation and capacity and potential decrease in access to information. So we have a variety of kinds of working groups. The working group that probably people at U of T know the best is our archiving group, because we held the first crowdsourced archiving event here. So, and that project was really organized around a kind of tool set to allow different events to crowdsource the archiving of data into the Internet Archive. And so it was very much collaboration with the Internet Archive and their end of term project. Then there's another working group that has been interviewing scientists and staff members at the EPA and other similar environmentally focused departments, but mostly the EPA, and then writing reports kind of from that perspective about what's been happening and what's the changes at the EPA. We also have a series of other kinds of reports that we've written about changes to environmental regulation and analyzing that. Then in addition, we have this important group, which is web monitoring. And web monitoring uses both proprietary, and they can say more, but proprietary as well as some of our bespoke technologies that Rob has been crucial in making to monitor changes of language in government websites. And then how we began was reporting those changes then that we thought were relevant to journalists that we built relationships to. So when you see like stories in like the New York Times or the Washington Post about like some change in language on a website, that most likely comes from edgy work. And then since then, though, we've also written reports that come out of our research from web monitoring, and as Eric says, have developed more research analysis of that work. And then lastly, we have another working group that is the one I'm most involved in, that's more about the values and frameworks for thinking about what environmental data justice might look like. And so that's bringing kind of insights from this kind of work, but also from environmental justice organizations that use data all the time. And data doesn't always work well for environmental justice. So one of the things we wrestled with is kind of preserving a lot of data that we knew was industry reported data that, you know, is mostly evidence of how the data doesn't serve people, as opposed to evidence of wonderful data that's going to solve all the problems. So that's another working group. So we have since gotten funding. So we started off as an all volunteer organization. We're about 150 people, mostly in the United States, but also a node in Toronto. But now we have funding from mostly the Packard Fund, but also Doris Duke. And so we do have paid project managers in our various working groups, and as well as some paid technical work. And so we're in a period of change in that way, perhaps more institutionalization. But what will happen is still, inflow. So that's kind of an overview of EDGI. And I don't know, Matt, do you want to talk about archiving, and then these guys will talk about web monitoring?
Sure. So these are two projects that started off as kind of the same thing. During this data rescue era, we hadn't really clarified what we meant by data. And we eventually kind of delineated these two domains of like HTML of web pages on the one hand, which we think of as like mostly government communication tools. And so the monitoring of websites is primarily an accountability effort, I would say. And then there's archiving data sets. And this can mean either like sets of PDFs, like publications, or it can mean tabular data of various kinds, or relational databases. that that someone has suggested could be in danger of removal or deletion.
And can I add to that?
Yeah.
That is partially possible just because there's so much more publicly available data in the United States than Canada. So
Yeah.
you both know that well.
That's a really, really important point.
Yeah.
It's always been the case.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the U.S. started out way in front of where Canada was.
Yeah.
And anyway, I would say that like archiving has been super interesting, and we've learned a ton from what we've done. And it's not obvious that we've ever like saved something that that someone else has then gone on to use, like a set of scientists or a group of environmental activists or something like that. Website monitoring, on the other hand, which is, as Bill talked about, is extremely labor intensive, has produced a large number of reports that have brought substantive, important issues to light in ways that other people haven't been able to do. So
should you turn over to these guys?
yeah, sure.
Okay, do you all want to talk about web monitoring and what it does and how it's organized?
Sure. Do you have stuff you want to say, Eric, or should I just?
I think Rob, you can go first, and I can build on what you say.
Okay. So I think Matt sort of mentioned we've had this approach of looking at sort of government web pages as government communications, and the effort in web monitoring started also pretty early on in Edgy's life, right around the very beginning of 2017, or maybe slightly before the
January.
End. Okay. I got involved in February when they were first starting to realize how labor intensive and hard it was to scale. But the idea there is that we're focusing on keeping track of the way language and communication changes in government web pages, both as a way to talk about access to information for the public, because this is the main way government tells the public what it's doing and how it's approaching things, but also seeing how that reflects or presages changes in policy at a higher level or at internal places where we can't normally see. And what we do with that is basically we currently monitor sort of a fixed list, a semi-fixed list of about 30,000 web pages. And when we see changes that we think are significant, either really significant on a single page or sort of systemic sets of changes that make a theme together across many pages, we publish reports to a media pool, and then journalists in that media pool will write stories about them under embargo for a little while and before it gets released, so that it's not too competitive. And so that's sort of like the main thrust of the goals and activity of that. The other thing that we weren't initially paying close attention to, and we've grown the amount of attention we've been paying to, is the idea of access and linking, especially as it pertains to data sets. So I think web monitoring mostly started as a thing about communications and language, but as an outgrowth of Edgy, which was originally really focused at the very, very beginning on archiving and this idea of like saving data, this sense that another way that data might be lost, not just that it's removed or that it stops being created, is that access to it might be reduced. And so one of the other things we've started paying much closer attention to over the course of the last year and a half is the idea of how well linked a data set might be, how many pages we see pointing to it, and whether those links are removed. Often major tools or data sets will disappear from like the sidebar navigation that's very prominent, and you'll have to dig through the website to find it. And that's a really meaningful change in our eyes. One thing that we're starting to do now is look at all this stuff in a much more systemic way. So like I said, we track this list of about 30,000 web pages, which is a very small set relative to the overall set of all web pages across major government websites. And especially as we've looked at this concept of accessibility, but also as Eric has started to do a lot more work around what can we say big picture in general about what's changed over the course of a year, over the course of a whole website, needing to sort of crawl those whole websites, do analyses against all those pages, especially looking at this idea of what we have started to call islanding or isthmusing of certain pages.
Islanding.
Yeah.
Islanding.
Like
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isolating.
Okay.
So the idea that a page or a data set gets isolated, so the government is able to say, well, it's still online and we maintain it, but nobody links to it, or the link to it is very, very hard to find. And so it's effectively offline, even though technically it's there. And that requires like a much broader and consistent analysis of sort of mapping a whole website on a regular basis to do. And so one of the lessons we've learned is that we should have been doing that from day one. Even if we were going to focus on looking at content changes on a small set of pages, we should have been trying to regularly map a website and see what things point to what other things across all of time. Because our problem now is we can go back and look at Internet archives, for example, earlier in time. But those are never particularly consistent in sort of mapping out an entire website. And so it's very hard to look at those and say, here's what the whole website looked at this point in time. So that's one of the other big things we're starting to do in terms of how we approach the monitoring work. Yeah.
Are there any questions already?
Let's see if Eric wanted to add something. Was that good, Eric?
I think that was a great overview of what we're doing, and yeah, I think we should just proceed with questions, and I'm happy to jump in whenever.
I've got a fairly naive question about the monitoring activities. I'm just, like you mentioned, that it's very resource intensive, and I'm just wondering how much of the work is done by humans looking at changes.
That's a great question. So I can jump in there because that's a lot of what I've been doing over the past nearly couple of years now. Nearly all of it is done by us, but increasingly we're developing ways of reducing the labor intensity of this effort. So when we started out, we were looking at pages every 3 days or so. We've scaled that back in order to make the effort a bit more sustainable on our volunteers. So we might look at our set of pages every week now. We've also, Rob and others have developed really helpful ways of identifying, what kinds of changes have happened. So allowing analysts, our volunteer analysts, to go in and see specifically which links have changed, which parts of the source code, that sort of thing, whether it's just a text change or whether there's link changes that have happened. And more recently, doing some testing of a prioritization. So sort of scaling the size or significance of changes in order to help analysts identify, okay, this might be a really important change. So if I'm going to look at changes, I should look at this one first, and maybe this other one that had a lower score. And Rob can talk more about how those scores are calculated. Maybe we shouldn't look at that, or not prioritize it at least. So it's been a lot of labor, but we're constantly thinking about ways and developing ways to make it more sustainable.
I just want to add a step back from that for folks who don't know anything about web monitoring. It uses, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, version tracking software. So this software will do a crawl of the website and then pop up the incidences of website change and have the two pages next to each other with the changes highlighted. And then the problem there is that most changes are irrelevant. right? And so what Eric was talking about was the sorting between relevant and irrelevant changes. And then, you know, what Rob has done a lot is creating the filters that then try to make it more likely that we're able to prioritize and look at the relevant changes as opposed to sort through lots of irrelevant. Does that?
That's what Rob has done among many,
Yeah.
many other.
I was just trying to translate in a more.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great description. And maybe what I might add so that people have a sense of like what the process actually looks like for an analyst for the whole thing. So we monitor pages for changes to what they are, and on a very strict level of like, did what you get back when you sent a web browser to this web page appear different than it was yesterday, basically, every day. And sometimes that means something really minor, like an apostrophe was added or a typo was fixed, or even something non-visible changed, like some typo in the source code changed or something. And so initially, so what we do with all those changes is we put them in sets of spreadsheets for the analysts to sort of organize their work. So analysts sign up for particular pages or domains, and they get a spreadsheet every week with all the changes that we saw in that domain, with a link to view that change in a variety of ways. And once they're viewing the change, they're looking at a page in two versions of it, and they can select on the left and right side what time that we captured a version and compare anything. So frequently they're looking at what changed since the last time I looked at this, and then what's changed between this and the first time we ever captured a snapshot of it, which is usually right around the administration change in the US here, right around Trump's inauguration. And then based on that, analysts mark up annotations about whether they think it's significant and what might be significant about it. The things that we've done that Eric was talking about that are more recent is trying to prioritize those changes and be able to annotate for analysts before they even get started. Most of these things that changed, you probably don't care about because the change is pretty minor. Here are the ones that we think are like really worth your time, and we put those up at the top of the sheet, and we give them a number sort of from 0 to 1 that says how big a deal we think this change might be. And the way we prioritize that change is sort of an evolving thing. We've taken the approach of treating that like a priority rather than a rating for significance, because what we've found is that understanding what's significant is really hard to do computationally, and especially hard when it is often very context sensitive. So we'll often have analysts looking at a page and seeing a change that they're not entirely sure is meaningful, and they sort of bring it back to the group in a weekly meeting where people discuss things they've seen that they think might have been meaningful. And somebody who has more expertise in a particular subject area might say, oh, wait, that standard that's being mentioned there is super important. This is a big deal. Or they might say, oh, no, that change that you're looking at, it looks like a big thing, but it's a regular thing that they do on a monthly basis or a yearly basis or whatever. So there's a lot of context sensitivity in what is an important change in a particular place. So we try to take a step back from saying too much about what actually is important or not computationally, and more treating that as a assistive set of tools or priorities for the analysts to do their work. And I can talk more about how we put that number together if you're curious. It's an evolving thing, and we keep adding stuff to try and make that priority number better. We had a group we worked with for a while who was interested in doing machine learning, and that didn't pan out to be particularly effective. So it's a much more sort of set of heuristics that we've evolved over time rather than anything statistically based.
Thank you. Yeah, that clarifies a lot of questions I had about what the website monitoring actually entailed. Did anyone have any other questions? It
Not knowing anything or much at all about Edgy, lots of things interest me, but I'm wondering how the group makes decisions about what to emphasize in terms of effort. Is it dependent largely on volunteer interest, or the work you're doing, archiving, protecting data, has enormous academic interest. But you also mentioned that you had some interest in reaching journalists, and I wonder how much resonance what you've been describing has at a time when the changes are so thick and fast, when you've got California being sued or countersuing regarding its ability to maintain its own vehicle emission standards, massive on the ground environmental consequences that, even though they're massive, you'll find most Americans don't grasp and don't understand. And what you're doing there is terrific, and at the same time very, very nuanced. And how can you get anybody to sit up and notice about, even if it was wholesale loss of websites? Oh, who cares?
Do y'all want to answer
I
that?
think that's really it's the who cares question.
I could answer, or you probably know more.
I can start an answer. I think we all probably have things to say here. I can start with a more sort of, fine-grained response to maybe the first part of your question in terms of how do we decide what to focus on. I'd say there's two levels to that. So one, yes, is, it's about figuring out what websites to really focus on. Again, this is labor-intensive work, and so we can't possibly put our eyeballs on all of the URLs every week. So each volunteer, we try to allocate those, who looks at what based on interest, right? So if somebody comes in with particular interest or expertise in water or the US EPA or something like that, we try to match them up with that. Another component of that is we look at websites, or we pay particular attention to ones that people, maybe current government employees or former officials, tell us are important, and signal, hey, maybe something's about to change on this page in terms of access or language. So we've definitely started monitoring websites because somebody has come to us and requested that. But then second, and I think this is maybe more the gist of your question, but in terms of how do we decide what's important in terms of the changes we see, and that is, it's a process. It's we see a lot of changes that we simply don't have, even important changes that we don't have the resources to write about and to fully explore. And so we compile them and we make note of them. We have a database of important changes we've noticed that we just haven't had time or the resources to actually write up a full report about and then send that out to journalists. Our perspective has really always been, we can identify these changes and make note of them. We can't really contextualize why they happened or, those kinds of questions. And so it's always been a matter of working closely with journalists to say, hey, here's our report. This is, the fine details of what happened and what changed on this page and when. We think it matters because there's this conversation going on around climate change and water quality and endangered species. Journalists, can you help us put this into context? And I think, there's been a lot of interest in that work. I think it really is shocking to many people. Yeah, maybe not everybody, but that the US EPA has removed all of its climate change pages. or pages under the climate change domain. So, yeah.
I think it might help that the national attitude towards climate in particular, the national government's attitude towards climate change regulation, it underwent such a dramatic shift. And that climate is a high-ranked issue in America, if you do surveys. So there's a lot of popular interest, and it plays pretty easily into a kind of established narrative about what's changing under the Trump administration. And so it accords well with big stories that the mainstream media is also interested in. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So there's like a fit for journalists. And that, I don't actually have, strangely, as good a sense of whether that's true here in Ontario or not. Like, clearly,
I have a strong
stuff is
sense.
happening.
I have a strong sense that it's not true.
That it doesn't matter.
It doesn't, no. I have a pretty visceral sense. And just to explain that the last 2 or 3 years, one of the things I did is I was out in communities all over Ontario explaining how the Environmental Bill of Rights works, what the toolkit is that citizens have. And I would often find myself in front of citizens who were faced with a proposed landfill site just outside their downtown in an old worked out gravel pit, just to give you some examples. Or in front of naturalists who know that the local shoreline of their town is a federally valuable migratory bird stopover place, and it's going to be expanded as a marina. So very, could say gross, crass, simple, shocking things. And people who have very few tools at their disposal to address them, and very little information. And as well, working in communities where the local media is shutting down more or less as my bus arrives. They warn me that, there will be a story in tomorrow's Inquirer, Independent, whatnot. Will that be okay? Oh, yeah, absolutely. And if I get the phone call the next day to say, our newspaper shut down. It was just happened yesterday. We didn't know. So So these things are happening at the same time, and then at the same time you find at the provincial level you have a few media outlets that can't keep up with even the big stories. That's the challenge, is they can't keep up with the pace and with the very big stories. And this is very sophisticated and fine-grained. That's all I'm.
Yeah.
That's all
I guess
saying.
what I would say is I agree with you that, like, in the case of edgy, we're talking about the United States and these, yes, there is the same problem with local newspapers, but there also is things like the New York Times and the Washington Post, plus things like
New York.
or Vice Media, or these kind of online things. So they also report on things here, but and here we have more limited, right? We have like the Star, the Globe, like we have more limited, a smaller media pool. It's a smaller place. But I would say that I wouldn't necessarily characterize the reporting as being so fine-grained, in that it's more like the reports, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but they offer the reporters a hook with evidence to write a story around that's about big things like, what's the position of the administration on climate change? So it provides, when like the administration says we still care about climate change, we're just shutting down all the programs that have anything to do with it, like they are in Ontario. It provides evidence to the big story, as opposed to, that allows them to write another story. And because we kind of pass the report on, as it's like, here it is, it gives that opportunity to write that story again. And so at Edgy, they built a pool of journalists who are interested in this. Of course, it's a bigger pool to pass the stories to. Do you think that's a fair description, guys? Okay.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. Yeah, it's a hook.
So is there a pool here that we
I'm
already
worried
have?
about our time. Should
Yeah.
we go to our
Yeah.
next item?
Yes, yeah.
Sure. Well, I think this ties in really well with this discussion because the work that we do can't answer that who cares question clearly, and that's why we're here. Just a little bit about what we do. So we web archive the Ontario government ministry sites twice a year, agency sites annually, and this is something that is done through the library by me and an intern as a means of addressing our the end of like print depository programs. So we used to get print documents from the government. Now it's all online, and the Ontario government does not have a comprehensive approach for archiving and making their documents available. Yes.
I just want to let you go. I just blamed myself. I put myself in the stack.
Yes.
Sorry.
We're not heavily staffed, as I said. We use limited tools. We use a web archiving tool through the Internet Archive that can't get at some of the meaty data that Edgy's been trying to get.
Is this Archive It?
Archive It, yeah. We use Archive It with a mixture of other tools like Web Recorder that allow us to get at high fidelity material. Another tool called WarkIt that enables us to take raw files and wrap them up into an archival file format that we can serve back in the browser. We started out mostly just interested in documents like serials, monographs produced by the government, things that we used to get in print, but now that's expanding, and the researcher expectation is that we'll also help people provide access to data sets. The Ontario Open Data Directive, in my opinion, and people I've spoken with, doesn't have a lot of teeth. So the data sets that go up to the Ontario Open Data Catalog aren't hosted there. They're hosted on ministry sites that don't have a web archiving program in place. There is no strong legislation that prevents ministries from yanking their data set down if it has to be updated or changed. So if researchers need to look at things over time, that's going to be a problem. So we're trying to respond to this proactively by web archiving stuff. But as you can imagine, with a small staff, it's not really feasible. We can't stay on top of changes. We can't predict what's going to come down or how much attention we need to expend on things. So we're coming to the realization that we can't do this alone anymore. Even though we can continue doing the program we do, we need to focus and prioritize. There's issues at the Ontario government level around archivability of websites. The formatting of things doesn't lend itself well to the archiving of data sets. If things sit behind a database, we can't get at them. And I am looking for ways we can put pressure on government content producers to improve the archivability standards, so at the very least we can try to pull down some of this stuff and serve it back to researchers until the Ontario government can figure out what it does. Access is really all we can try to provide. Yeah, and just how do we take the work that we're already doing and serve this to a greater purpose is a question that we're grappling with. I don't think people really know what we do, why we do it, and there's complementary initiatives like Edgy that we could probably be talking together to figure out how we could move this story further and get more people aware of what's going on. And I don't know, Samchin, do you have anything to add from the CGI perspective, from the Canadian Government Information Collaborative Program?
We're even worse, sir, because you know we have to rely on your intern to do a lot of our.
like quality insurance of the website we have is because we just like volunteer our time to kind of do the web archiving because we know no one else is doing it. Like all those provincial website, like even the Library and Archive Canada, they wash their hand off about like preserving any of those. Yeah.
The provinces.
All the provinces that no one's taking care of. So we try to find those gaps, like that we can find out from all kind of story, people sending us email, please save this website, and then we try to do something. Like we are not doing it on a very systematic approach, try to capture all this website, but because we don't really have the resource to do it. We only get the money for the archival account on a yearly basis that each of the 10 participants have, like institution, they have to just give that $450 per year for that particular account, and that's it.
How 450,000 you mean?
450, because we are using
Dollars,
$450 per year to subscribe to that particular tools. We call it archival.
Oh.
Yeah.
But the interest is so, the kind of, what I'm hearing you say is the commitment is so low that even assembling the $450 feels like passing the hat around, when in a better world you'd have institutions valuing the archive. Yeah.
Yeah, and we always have to kind of justify why we have to do it, kind of like, you know, right? Because it's not your mandate to preserve the document. The Library and Archive should have like the mandate. Why do you have to do this? Mm-hmm. You know, so every time we do something, we have to justify, it's because we wanted to serve the researcher, no one else is doing it. It's like in that kind of like mentality, so that we are not really having a lot of support as well. But we try. Every time we receive requests, we try to.
What would you need to get more support?
Well, that would be great if we
what would you need? Like what do you need?
What would enable you?
What would enable it? Who needs to be convinced? Who needs to know about it and understand it's important?
That's a very good question. Who care about it? That's the point.
I would say, like, sorry to jump in, Samson. I think, like, the UOT collection, which, by the way, like, we have institutional support. We're not in a pass-the-hat situation. I think our administration feels good about what we do. But the problem with web archiving, and it may be similar with the data archiving that Edgy does, is that it's speculative. Like, you proactively get stuff that doesn't necessarily have research value in the moment. So you're proactively getting this stuff. A lot of institutions may be hesitant to put money in that when, say, Elsevier and other publishers are charging this an arm and a leg for journals, and as a budget line item, like this thing that in the future might be important for researchers, but we don't know. It gets hard to justify, so we need good stories, either from scholars or the journalists.
Yeah, the same situation.
Reports written, and you need journalists who are going to pick it up.
We need allies who have a bigger voice than us.
Or, you know, academic researchers saying, I'm actively using this resource and it's allowed me to publish this or that, right?
Yeah.
I would assume that would be useful.
Definitely.
But then, I mean, part of it is also, I mean, I know for these guys, like, working with the Word format is very difficult, often, right? The Word specification is long and confused.
I'm happy to talk about some tools, but that might not be of interest for everybody at the table, but some tools that have been done using our collections that have made a lot of like things like tracking keywords over time. Looking at linking patterns between different websites that work with the work files, what we create, that has gotten a lot easier with some tools that have been developed that I'm happy to share that we use. But then who cares? When we have these things, we don't know what to do with this information after.
Right.
So is anybody at this point writing anything about what you do, or do you have time to write things, or just to put the stories together for people?
Time is pretty sparse for us. we wear many different hats in the institution. I'd be happy to contribute to something. We have one researcher at the University of Waterloo who built the toolkit, Ian Milligan, and Nick Rouet at York, who do write regularly about using web archives, but not with this environmental slant. They did a comparison of the Obama-Trump years by looking at, I believe, the Library of Congress work files, just demonstrating changes in topics, how things have evolved, like topic modeling, and seeing how that switches over time. But that requires expertise that, like, I have access to the tools and the data, but then what? I'm not necessarily a communications or environment or scholar of any kind. I have a very specific training.
So the issue here then is to link up with people who can write some of the analyses with whom you would work in order to supply the information to them. But EDGI does it first. They first supply the information and then go to the journalists, which would be, because the journalists are under pressure too.
And I would say this is that the difference is the difference between archiving and web monitoring, right? So the web monitoring needs different tools than the archiving in order, if you want to say that, the stories that you want to share is that there's changes happening.
Yes.
Right?
But they aren't good.
And they're not good. So like if we look even, I'm just like thinking, like we moved a little bit into our brainstorming session. If we think about the closing of the Environmental Commissioner office, but also the Open for Business bill, which looks a lot like a Harper Omnibus bill in terms of clustering so many changes about the environment together, including things like getting rid of the toxics, I forget what it's called here, but the
Toxics Reduction Act.
The Toxics Reduction Act.
The Clean Water Act is to be under.
And environmental exemptions, wide-ranging exemptions for environmental assessment, and so on, is all on the.
And freedom to municipalities to. It opens up the greenbelt, for example.
Yes.
To those.
So we know. So it's kind of we've gotten a heads up that all these things are on the table to be dismantled, right?
Yes.
And so just in terms of thinking. So on the one hand, those are the things to look at in terms of archiving priorities around environment, right? And then a question is, can you translate that into a story? Mm-hmm. Or do you feel like there's something in terms of our right to know, being interested in some kind of website monitoring or something something similar like that for Ontario?
Yeah. I feel like not everybody is in the same role. People in different roles are going to have different ways of making decisions. But for an organization that's interested, whose focus is primarily on the environment, I think one question is this use of our resources a wise allocation of our time? So do we think that by tracking and describing changes to websites, we will be able to tell a story that is sufficiently compelling to, Ontarians, but to be effective so that story becomes a tool in the struggle to preserve environmental regulation or to protect the environment. Mm-hmm. And if one doesn't feel like that's likely to have a positive outcome, then I think for the environmental organization, the impetus is removed. For the archivist, the impetus is still going to be there because the archivists have lots of reasons to want to have a good record, and it has less to do with the pressures of the immediate moment, I think, at least professionally. So, but I think, for a kind of collaboration to work, there's going to be different kinds of effort that different people have to put in, and you have to decide. It would be good to take a look before you dive into it. like Rob probably thought he was committing about 2 weeks to this effort in January of 2017. And I mean, it's kind of been a great ride, right? But it's been a kind of a crazy ride too.
Yeah, a lot of work.
So I kind of really like the edge, have like the website of the website monitoring, keep track of what happened for what website, and then report to which journalist or Washington Post or whatever. Keep track of all these kind of changes, and then try to maybe build a big story later on. Maybe the hour. Right to know that you guys used to have a timeline to keep track.
We still
of
have the timeline,
right?
They're
So we
keeping
might build another page just focus on Environment Ontario and have all those changes.
That's what we're trying to do. We have included now Ontario, and then we have to decide whether we want to keep it under Canada or whether we just want to have Canada Ontario as a separate one, which might be a good idea.
Yeah, and first of all, we can't build a story yet. We might want to keep track with all those things, like they want to cut down the commission or all those act or whatever.
Well, those we would collect. We are collecting right now as individual items, but like eventually, with all of that, you can construct a story. I was thinking whether it's worth one's while to have an event where you sort of like you have to decide who you gear it towards, right? I was thinking of a title. I don't think I can use murdered and missing information because
No.
I know, but you could have destroyed missing information, or what do you do when information isn't there, or something like that, right?
I think the story, though, is bigger than information. The information is interesting, but the story really is that it's signaling changes in regulation, changes in value, changes, that this, the Ford administration is very interested in dismantling environmental regulation and you don't have to construct the story in the sense that they have constructed it, in that they have they have put forward a proposal called Open for Business, which involves reducing the burden of environmental regulation on economic enterprise.
I think you're right. I think that is the strong story, and that's the story that is it has some legs, and in fact it is so stark that there are sort of adjunct stories like today's story, which is that the mayor of Barrie, who is surely not a rabid environmentalist, said about this very legislation that you're talking about, said has gone way, way, way too far. Way, way, way too far. That was the headline. So when the very politicians, the very municipalities who should be welcoming this dismantling with open arms are going, oh, way, 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 way too far. I think there's a story. But the numbness of the populace as a whole, given everything else that's rolling out, that's what you're really fighting about. So you have to keep in mind that there is this cacophony of crazy stuff going on, whether it's with the OPP or with, all of that is happening at the same time. And so you really have to ask who your audience is. Now, if your audience are academics, 10 years from now, they will be intensely grateful, but they're not at the table here, right?
To me, this is not about environment, but it has relations, which is the other story, which I think is getting picked up a lot less. So the other thing happening is the putting the brakes or canceling or closing things that have to do with support for reconciliation or Indigenous people. So, for example, they just fired the whole staff, I think it was yesterday, in Ontario Arts Council, the whole Indigenous staff got fired. When they changed the curriculum, they also got rid of the implementation of the reconciliation curriculum. So this is the other thing that's happening, and that you can see the pattern already. In addition to the environmental thing, is the stark difference in policy between the federal level for whatever criticisms we want to give the federal level. I'm happy to do that all day long as well. But comparing that to the Ontario government, which is like just firing people and closing things down.
Well, and I mean, the package in which the environmental commissioner was scrapped included eliminating the child
The
advocate.
Child Act, exactly, which is another anti-Indigenous move.
The Francophone Services Commissioner. So there were 3 watchdogs. And I mean, so there was essentially a show trial day where I got my 5 minutes to speak. Really, I'm a retiree speaking on behalf of the environmental commissioner. So the child advocate had 5 minutes to speak to, and was mixed in with right after that came firefighters who had a completely different issue. So it was the jumble that comes when omnibus bills come through. The jumble of outrage and chaos is huge, right? And so in comparison, you have a sophisticated, nuanced story about websites altering, right? That's what I keep.
Language. It's about language and data.
It's which tragedy is worse, right?
I think it's also that data has we've talked about this in EDGI, it has a charisma, like data and science has a charisma, and so it can be a meeting point, like people from a lot of different political viewpoints can decide that they care about science, they care about empiricism and data, and are kind of, that will pull people into caring about other things. So that was also something we saw. But this is maybe a different moment too. Here. I mean, I'm kind of looking to Mark because you're the one who convened the meeting.
Yeah. Obviously, I agree with the fact that what is the important aspect is the thing that is actually happening, and there's a bit of information on that there. I think there is a purpose in focusing on the data because that's the part that's not there, I think, in Canada. Mm-hmm. And so maybe just my own prejudice. I mean, obviously, I agree with the overall assessment of what's important. I was thinking that it might be helpful if we did, like if Nick did a report on what's happening on the web that then can be distributed to the environmental organizations who might be able to use it to make their job, like to add a perspective to what they're doing that they wouldn't otherwise have the time to find out. So you look at it not as the only thing that needs to be done, but it's one aspect that I think is ignored or not given sufficient attention, and that many people wouldn't even think about. They only think about the actual change that's happening. They're not thinking about what are the consequences when you then disappear. Whole sets of knowledge that you need in order to formulate alternatives, and they're no longer there. And to me, that's like a part that's under emphasized. And so that's where I was thinking, I mean, one of the things one could do, which would be, I thought, relatively easy, I mean, looking at analysis of websites, that's, well, maybe we get people like Alan who can write something about, I don't know, or find others. But as a relatively simple analysis, I looked at the ministry, at some of them, like the ministry report, because it's only one-dimensional. The websites are so complicated. I'm hoping that you have the ideas what one can do. But just looking at the ministerial things and looking at maybe the last month of the previous government and then what's there now, and then look at, for instance, how many adding up, like the old ones under WIN, there was a lot of on the climate change issue than people who were fined. Just adding up the fines that were done then and which are done now might be one aspect of analysis. It would be pretty, very straightforward and quite simple to do, right? Then what is no longer, what was there before and what is no longer there? And that would be very simple type of analysis, but I thought it might be like an easy entry maybe in doing some of it here.
So some of that is like we just published this report about enforcement, the EPA and enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
There is a somewhat straightforward. Now it's been a year and a half, almost 2 years of the Trump administration. So there are numbers about what the extent to which regulations are being enforced in the United States.
Yeah. If the regulations are still there. I mean,
so in the United States, they have legal regulations which haven't changed, and then they have policies around, or they have laws that haven't changed, and then interpretations, official policies around those laws, which have changed a lot.
Yeah.
And that then translates into different kinds of enforcement actions. And so the people who did this work on me were able to show a really dramatic change.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably because the numbers are published annually and those are out now.
Yeah.
So it's already happened.
Compared.
And it was still like not a small amount of work. It was a lot of work.
I think we've learned at Edgy is everything's a lot of work. Is that what is? That's our main finding as an organization.
Eric, did you work on that EPA report? Did you do any of those tables, or is that all late?
I did not, but I have done a little bit of work on a follow-up for compliance. So that might be forthcoming.
I mean, and you know a lot as a deputy environmental commissioner in your role, but I mean, I kind of agree with you in some ways. Like, lots of my work's about Chemical Valley, and people are shocked by how poor the emissions are regulated in the first place. So even when we compare our regulations just to what's happening across the border, already before Ford, it's appalling.
It's appalling. Yeah.
And so it's, so it's quite, and it's very, very difficult to get information, much more difficult than in the United States in terms of the publicly available environmental information. So people don't even know that. Right? So they come and they, why don't you try this idea or that idea? You're like, well, that's not a thing. You can't get the information. There's no one to take it to. I mean, you can go on and on. It's just the construction of the thing works differently here. So it is quite a different political circumstance in some ways.
We're much more threadbare to begin with.
Much more threadbare to begin with, exactly. Yeah. But it is the case, though, that some of these. But if we take any of these changes that we know are in the pile on the Open for Business Act, or whatever it's called. Is it Open for Business?
No, it's Bill 66.
Bill 66.
Sort of
Bill 66, that's the announcement of what's going to happen. And one of the things is that people don't know, like it does take research and work to say, well, what are these things that are being dismantled? And even if you might not be able to describe all of them, even if you describe 3 of them, and Margaret, I'm sure you could find people to describe 3 who have, knowledge of 3 of the things being taken apart, and write up that kind of press release and share it with the media. That would probably be very, that would be as effective as saying that this language changed on the website, I think. Because it's even what are those laws that are being changed? What are those departments? People don't even know what those are. There's a research work to just describe them and what they do.
We're going to, for example, the Canadian Environmental Law Association, Teresa McClanahan and Rick Lindgren, and that crew, or Eco Justice. Mm-hmm. those would be the two biggies that I would go to, who keep their finger on that. And
And this is sort of related, but like when you have those discussions, I'd really appreciate it if you kick that information to me, because we can't stay on top of all of these changes. I'm just one person making selection decisions with a high school student that works 15 hours a week, and between Sanchin and I,
Exactly.
we don't know what's coming on the US bill. We'll probably do a sweep of the Ministry of Environment site. We've archived the Environmental Commissioner site, as well as the Child and Youth Advocate and the FLSC. But yeah.
I was going to ask you guys maybe, so with this knowledge that you have now about the kinds of archiving that these guys do, are there any hints, like any lessons from what you've learned about how that work might be made most effective? You know, like, are there things that you talked about, those site maps that they would be useful to have now, those link maps. Are there other things that you know, or kind of lessons learned?
From the technical side, I would say, I mean, that the site mapping thing is a big one. I would say that for us, understanding better, like, what our various partners for doing the actual crawling and archiving of things could and couldn't do, because we're making big changes now based on that, but now is like a year and a half or almost 2 years into the effort. And I think folks at the table here are maybe starting from a different place. You know, one of you being somebody who professionally does archive websites and has a lot of that data. But I know you mentioned, like, when using Archive It, there are serious limitations, and we have run headlong into those. Internet Archive became one of our partners earlier this year, and we were super excited about that at first, and we're still super excited about that, but we did not understand some of those limitations until trying to work a lot more with that data that we now feel like we have a much better handle on. But it doesn't mean that we've solved them. And solving them probably means doing a lot of work that we were hoping we could depend on the Internet Archive to do for us. So knowing what the issues are with, like, other methods of doing archiving and to what degree we need to manage that ourselves would have been a big thing. And I think also, because we're starting to look into more of the systematic stuff, not just the mapping, but better organizing our archived data for doing that kind of work. We've built a whole lot of tools that I think have helped Eric a lot, and he can say a lot more about this aspect of it. But I know that there's a lot of ways we could have structured things, and things that I've been thinking about in the back of my head for the last month or so, since he started pushing on that a lot harder, that we could have structured stuff better in the first place to make it easier to say, I want to look at, like, all the pages that we have for the last year and, like, do this kind of analysis, and ways that we could expose that data that makes doing that analysis later much easier, especially across a broad set of things.
I was actually thinking we actually can make good use of what we have captured before and after. Like, we have both kind of capture, right? So if we at the moment do not have those sophisticated tools to do those web monitoring, we at least can compare what has been disappeared from the website. And I actually learned from this group saying that actually that happened to me, that a lot of the very good resources that I have to really dig deep to find it. Like, for example, like I want to find the air quality health index. It used to be in the previous site. The second link you already got it. But now, with my experience of using government web pages, I have to do a lot of, like, digging, and then in order to find this very valuable resource that they keep track for the last couple of years for each of the area, like what is the reading of the emission of that kind of index. So this might be something we don't really need a lot of the high technology, but we still can be able to do a very brief analysis on what we already captured. And this might add up to the article of like we identify 3 major cancellation or regulatory change or things like that. And then we give like a very more complete story.
Or here's 3 ways that that environmental information is becoming more inaccessible in Ontario.
That would be good.
And you don't have to be comprehensive, but the biggest 3 things that you've noticed. You know, this whole section has gone away. This thing is buried.
Yeah.
Whatever, you know.
Yeah. So the link is.
Yeah.
Have you noticed? I mean, this happened a few years ago, but the AODA requirements that was imposed on all Ontario government ministries materially deteriorated a lot of
the volume of material is a lot less following AODA because the PDFs they couldn't be made accessible were just yanked because there had to be a transition to HTML. So the sites are sparse. The redesign of Ontario.ca, which is a regular thing that we talk to people at the Ontario government about, is designed not for someone who needs to get at research. It's to renew your driver's license. It's a customer service based orientation that has really made our jobs harder.
Yes, and this. Every scientist in Ontario, everyone who uses that is devastated by that. And that was not, I think that was not, there was no malignant intent, I don't think. It was just bad, just done because I've talked to the person who was on the committee of AODA, sort of an advisory committee, and he was also devastated by the fact that happened because it wasn't the intent of Ontarians with disabilities were not hoping to reduce accessibility of data or information.
I was interestingly at this Peggy, the Preservation of Electronic Government Information workshop in DC last weekend, and there were librarians, kind of prominent U.S. government librarians, talking about exactly that issue. That they went actually to audit their own files for compliance, and they realized almost none of their materials comply with the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so they have to make a decision. Do you just take it down, or is there some retrofitting, or put a notice up? But they
we're getting off agenda.
Yeah, sorry, I should be sharing this. This is something that's pretty dear.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not saying we've already used an hour, and so I'm right.
Oh, I thought I was thinking we had 2.
Oh, okay. I had about 2 hours.
Well,
that's okay.
The third thing that I'm going to add to with MT, right, is hard to find or disappear. They only keep the most current 3 years. That's something we might want to mention.
Yeah, that's pre-transition, though. That is. That's been going on for a long time. Well,
but the other people might not aware that they only, you compare to the one before that, we can maybe access a number of years of those data.
But what you're capturing will be kept indefinitely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But then we are not actually supposed to deal with it. Someone else supposed to put this data. But now they only have the most current 3 years available.
3 or 4 or 5?
For 3 to 4 years. Yeah.
You mean their own websites, like mirrors or?
The website to the public that only keep those current years.
Like publications, like the
I see, yes.
annual reports.
Yes.
Or even the index I was just mentioning, they only go back to, I think, 2014 or something. It might be worth for us to check. Like, only the current years are being capped or something like that, so that not just hard to find. It's like for researcher, if you have to do meaningful comparison, where would you find those information?
So I want to come back to Michelle's idea. Would it be possible for you, together or alone, I don't know, to write something about the 3 ways in which environmental information is more difficult to find and access and so on. Because to me, that would be like a good start into this.
Yeah, I would say with the caveat that like I could use some editorial help. Like, am I picking things that people don't understand?
Send it to me because I don't know much about it, and so that I'll.
And you're a very experienced writer, Margaret.
She's a very good writer. I submitted my article in there. Yeah.
And the other thing I was sort of hoping that.
And Phyllis Creighton is a very good editor, so.
Definitely, yeah.
That would be good. That would be a good start.
Maybe in January, get something together. Does anybody know, and I should know this as a government information librarian, but I haven't really been checking the status of Bill 66, but if we could somehow have a conversation about like what should I be worried about right now website-wise, and we can coordinate that somehow so that I can crawl what we need to crawl.
Yeah.
We're due for our semi-annual crawls and annual crawls of agencies and commissions and things in December, so it's a good time for us to get ahead of that.
Can you help on that?
Well, it's due. I mean, it's due for debate in January. So
for second reading,
I think so. Yeah. So
there was that roundup written by Environmental Defense. Did you think that was thorough?
I'd have to look at that. Yeah, I don't.
Because they had a kind of roundup of like, these are the things that are going to be cut related to environment.
Was it not? It might have been eco justice. It doesn't. Yeah. Oh,
I think it was environmental defense, but it could have been.
Yeah.
So one question I have is like, where are the possible points of contact between EDGI and this effort? It will depend a little bit on what the shape of the effort is. And are there kinds of support you would like that don't require too much support? We are really stretched. Everybody is overcommitted. But I think we're interested in the work, and it depends a little bit on like what shape it takes.
I'd say at a minimum to share workflows so we know how you do what you do, and maybe if we could get together and talk about what we do, like
sharing the tools
in the weeds, like this is our workflow. Where do you think you might have some ideas, and vice versa. If there's anything that I can offer in my minimal expertise working with web archives. That would be a great way forward for me. I'm really interested in looking at diffs because that can help us model when we should actually be archiving websites. If we can see, are there predictable ways to model when things change, like a week before a bill passes, or like where should we be planning things? Yeah, that stuff is really important to me.
I mean, it occurs to me that a lot of remember that a lot of data may have been out there because not because it was legislated that it must be available, right? So that means that they're not tied to the passage of a bill for yanking it either, right? That's an important thing to keep in mind. There's a lot of it. In fact, I will go away and think about what types of data are required by law to be available.
Yeah. It's probably not that much.
Not much.
And there is real.
So easy come, easy go, right? Yeah. That's the
exactly.
thing, right? It's so very different again from the U.S. situation.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's interesting just as a point in terms of like storying. What's happening is that there has been, because of the response of what happened under the Easy Go under the Harper years, that there has been that big push and to get some legislation about open access put into place at the federal level.
Yeah.
So just as that has finally been achieved, right? We're seeing then that because, of course, so much environmental stuff and environmental science happens at the provincial level, that it becomes the place where you can disappear things. Now that's a story arc that you could write up, Margaret, very easily. It ties to everything you know about Harper.
I think that's a very important point.
Which you know in incredible detail.
Yeah.
But and the arc towards all the effort to get that something at the federal level.
Elizabeth May has this legal initiative where she's asking that all federally funded research be actually published, but that hasn't come through. That's not been achieved at the federal level.
Okay, so there hasn't been something passed at the federal level.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay,
It's a legislative initiative, but it hasn't even gone to first reading.
And it's really okay, here's another point of comparison. Besides the United States, one could compare to the policies of the Tri-Council. The Tri-Council has very clear policies about any data collected has to be open access.
Yeah.
Right? So for all the federally funded researchers, and if we look, it'd be interesting, we could even look at the Ontario Research Fund and see what its policy on open access. So we're holding researchers accountable, but not the state accountable. I mean, I'm sure whatever and everyone knows that all that story about Harper, I mean, and about what happened, like, that was such a big story in Canada.
Well, everybody who is interested,
everyone who's interested,
maybe 2% of the population, is very optimistic.
Yeah. Okay, that could be so.
People occasionally, and they say, "Oh, really? That happened? Oh, and they closed libraries. Oh, and they burned books. Oh, I didn't know any of that."
Okay, except of that 2%, a large portion of that 2% were Ontarians. Just saying. There was an overwhelming concentration of that 2% in Ontario.
So I guess this is really, it's the audience story. The audience question keeps coming up again and again, right? And that's, I think that where my brain often goes is that in order to address the next provincial election, you have to be able to speak to the people who voted differently.
Exactly.
And that's the reality. So certainly, and the others have already been convinced. They're already seething and in despair. But how do you address people who say, "Oh, well, open for business sounds good to me," and there I'm totally at a loss, and I think that's the gulf between urban rural and I would have thought that actually very bread and butter environmental issues like needing access when your local groundwater is contaminated, that's a provincial issue. Did you know that? That's your property value right there. That those sorts of things would have traction. And people just hope it doesn't happen to them. That's really what it comes down to.
Do you guys over there have any thoughts about like what the parameters might be of any kind of even if not exactly collaboration, but what it would mean for what this effort would have to look like in order for us to be useful to it, or for it to be something that would make sense for us to in some way even minimally participate in?
That's a good question.
Yeah. Great Lakes issues.
I don't think it's that.
I can say a couple things. I think the point made earlier around sharing workflows is a really good one, and that seems relatively minimal. I'm not saying wouldn't be work, obviously, but I think there'd be a lot of payoff there. I think in terms of more extensive analysis and contributing to that effort, I'll say two things. One of which is that I'm very interested in this, having just moved to Ontario. Okay, so I'm volunteering myself to engage. That said, too, I think.
Great.
Say what?
You just said great.
Oh, okay, good.
Signed up for more than you intended.
But you know,
Met Margaret.
you know, I think doing what we're doing now is really important, which is to figure out audience, to figure out how to communicate the findings effectively and how people will be receive this information, considering the differences between what EDGI has been able to do in the US and sort of the discourse, the state of the conversation here in Canada. I think thinking through that a bit more, and then just coming up with a set of questions and goals, so we can really distill that. You know, maybe it's figuring out, okay, these are the 3 things at risk, and these are the 3 ways they've changed, you know, over the past year or whatever, and just running with that and becoming, just getting as concrete into those kinds of questions as possible would really help us, I think, you know, engage and contribute. Because as Rod said earlier, even at a very technical level, knowing what you want to achieve is, like, he's been able to, like, go back and you know, work on exposing some of our data and tools for that. But if I had known, you know, when I, you know, started engage in these kinds of systematic term analysis, what I had wanted to figure out, you know, I could have better collaborated with the software team. So anyway, yeah.
And I think for the tools part, I would be more than happy to sit down and have another call, or maybe I think a bunch of EDGI folks are going to be in Toronto in about a month for a few days and talk more about tools and like what we can share. It sounds like you have some great stuff, and if you're interested in our diff stuff, I mean, the Internet Archive is also starting to use it now too. One of the nice things about it is we wrote that part and that set of tools, so they're pretty abstract and independent of the rest of our stack.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all on GitHub.
Yeah, I would love to come and sit in on a meeting just to hear more about what you're doing.
Our meeting is in the same building that we're in right now. So their office and where the meeting is the same building, and it's also this where my lab is. We're all in the same spot, just to make life easy.
Right?
Great. Well, I think we have some concrete outcomes, some cooperation between EDGI and the people here. And Nick, you're going to work on
A blog post I gather.
a blog post or something, and we'll see how we can distribute it to various groups and all of that. We've only talked about environmental issues as an example, but I would think like social justice is just as important. And so particularly the indigenous aspect, but everything else as well. Is that you're collecting all these data, right?
Yeah, all ministries, all agencies.
Yeah.
For you guys, like when the Web Integrity Project started to look at other domains, how much seemed like it could transfer from what you were doing to another domain? Like, how much domain specificity was there?
From the technical side, I think it's almost all what we have right now is almost all totally transferable. There are a bunch of things on our like near-term horizon that are less transferable as we're starting to get more into the like automatic prioritization and other stuff. Because the more you dig into that, the more you say, oh, we have this particular context. We can say a lot more about what probably matters given that context. But we're also trying to write the code for that in a way that's relatively abstract, so that somebody else could use it and sub in different keywords or different, you know, whatever information.
You know, and it also just always comes back to policy expertise. You know, I can tell whether, you know, an US EPA water quality page has changed. And maybe it's changed in substantial ways, but whether those are significant changes in the context of US water policy, you know, I've got to have that expertise or know somebody who does, and to be able to reach out to them. So, yeah, you've got to have that.
So I guess one of the questions is, Alan, would you be willing to be somebody people could come to ask whether things, how important things are?
Yeah, on a case by case.
Yeah, I mean, that's... And Michelle, would you know anybody who we could go to for social justice issues?
About what's
yourself?
happening?
Yeah, besides yourself?
No, about if evaluating changes that show up. But I mean, one thing to think is like, who's looking? Like, are you really?
No, it was social justice.
In order to find those changes, you have to be looking. So,
Well, if like, we'll start with environmental stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, right
Just
now.
looking at changes between when for just two snapshots.
Yeah, yeah.
It might be early days too.
Mm-hmm.
Like one of the things that we found, I don't know if you agree with this, but it took some time. Like I remember like the night that of inauguration, we were ready for all the website changes. Well, it takes the staff some time to implement website changes. So we have that going, you know, so it'll take time for everything to show. So the snapshot now, but it's probably important to have a snapshot in 6 months.
Yeah.
Or
Which we do semi-annually.
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, some of it is not that complicated. I mean, you mentioned the loss of mandate letters.
Yeah.
That's, for anybody in this world of policy, that's huge, right? But for most people, again, like, what?
Never heard that.
What is that?
But I'm not sure that the threshold of most people should be the threshold for action. I think, you know, if you have a theory of change that is about having to get most people to care about something, then you're going to have a very, think nothing is worth doing. But it is the case that particular professional bodies can mobilize a lot of pressure onto policy. It is the case that, helping those professional bodies understand because all the changes, like you're saying, are very rapid. So doing that analysis so people understand, the Orwellian doublespeak that's behind, some of the ways that legislative changes are put forward as if they're a good thing. And you just need someone to write out, here's the explanation of why it's the opposite of what it says, and disseminate that amongst the people who care about it. Then that gives everyone the language.
It gives them a sounder footing to understand.
Or to say something, or to speak out about it, or to follow it in the newspaper. But so I don't think the threshold should be getting everyone or, having all communities or something like that. I mean, it's partially just thinking about this kind of, okay, who's interested in policy? Well, it's those people who are going to care about all these changes in policy. And if you get them riled enough, they might be able to hold the government accountable in ways that are quite effective.
And I think also helping the organizations which are already working on that issue, giving them one other little tool that they can use to. I think that's also worthwhile.
So just, to say with EDGI, we often, have fantasies of, working with grassroots organizations, but mostly we work, this is just true, with other professionals and other professional organizations, including scientists, former staffers, their associations, and so on. And those people are very knowledgeable and can put a lot of pressure on or write other things or et cetera. And so, yeah, I just want to kind of give a sense of there is a more optimistic way to think about the theory of change.
Perfect. Okay, well, we've definitely got some concrete action items to work through. Is there anything else that you want to talk about?
I really would like the website still keep on those timeline with the Ontario piece.
Yes, well, we're doing that,
so.
and but it's hit and miss for us.
Oh, okay.
So
there's too many things happening.
Yeah.
That we
So
don't
if
keep track
you
of.
would actually send us items, we will abstract them and put them on there. And we've started. I don't know. Are you actually on our list or not?
Yes, I mean,
Yeah.
I am.
So we've now started to sort of send stuff around when we put stuff in there, right? I'm behind always, but I'll send another one before the weekend with some things. So it's yeah.
I always enjoy reading because sometimes when I want to write something, I forget the day, the time, whatever, and then I just go back and check. Oh, it's actually that year or what month. So it's really helpful.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
It might be a case that places like CELA or EcoJustice could also point content in your direction in the sense, or collab. Those might be some really good organizations for RHNO to collaborate with in terms of they are tracking these changes. Like they're the people most tracking these changes.
Yes, well, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Well, we are only tracking them when it becomes public
In the
data
store,
or something like that. We're not tracking because we're not an organization, not an environmental organization or a social justice or any of that, right? It's a different niche. So,
but in the way of explaining what's the point or providing the context for when data is lost or why it was lost, they would be the experts.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's why one should do it together with them, for sure, no question. Yes, that's what we've done in the past, so kind of like work with the other organizations. And as a small organization, there's a limit to what you can do anyhow.
Yeah.
Very strict limit.
Maybe you have to activate a new Ontario Right to Know network.
Are you in their list?
I'm not, but I'll.
I will put you on there. I don't think I have Eric's email. And you'll send it to me, right?
We'll connect. Is it okay we pass on your email to Margaret? Okay.
Yeah. Eric, I'll probably get it for you on Slack from you. I don't know that I have sure. We're using that much.
Okay. Yeah. I guess we're on other platforms. Should we let our colleagues go?
Yeah. Thanks for coming, you guys.
Thank you, Robert and Eric. Very appreciated.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Do you want to stop recording too?